and thank you all for joining us for today's ASCE Texas Section webinar titled ASCE Government Relations and Public Relations Overview. If you're not a member of ASCE or the Texas Section, I invite you to become a member so that you can benefit from being part of this professional association and all the gratifying and meaningful volunteer opportunities that we get to do. So now I'm pleased to introduce the presenter for today's webinar, Kevin Longley, Director of Media Relations and Public Affairs at the society level of ASCE. Kevin Longley is the Director of Media Relations and Public Affairs for the American Society of Civil Engineers and has been with the society for 4 years. With ASCE, Kevin has led the media campaigns for the Society's major advocacy initiatives, including the Report Card for America's Infrastructure, the Failure to Act series, ASCE Convention and OPAL programs, and the ongoing Engineering and Public Works Roadshow. In his role, Kevin also communicates with members of the media seeking information or interviews with members, preparing spokespeople for these opportunities and creating communications plans when the society faces an influx of media requests, particularly when an infrastructure-related catastrophe is taking place. Prior to ASCE, Kevin served as a producer for SiriusXM's Fantasy Sports Radio and NASCAR radio channels, creating and planning programming for more than 24 shows across the 2 channels. With that, take it away, Kevin.
Yeah, thanks, Chris, and thanks everyone for joining us today. I know this is like kind of that crazy last-minute week where right before you have the week that everyone takes off, you're trying to cram everything into this, and so I know there's a lot of meetings, more so than usual, that go on this year or this week as everyone's trying to cram in before the end of the year. So I appreciate you taking the time to meet for this Government Relations and Public Relations University. And for those of you who don't know about these programs, just to give you a bit of a background of them, the Government Relations University is its own event, and so is the Public Relations University, but there's a lot of overlap between the themes. You're really just figuring out how to cater to different audiences. GR, focuses on how are you relating to elected officials and how are you getting your message across and your advocacy points. Public relations, obviously, you're focused on more of the masses, right? Mass media, traditional media markets, in addition to just, communities and how you're getting your message across to neighbors and people like that, as well as reporters. So the key word here, though, is relations. It's how to get your message across. It's how to make sure that you are being effective when you're communicating your priority issues. And so there's a lot of overlap here. I'll also let you know that usually these are like kind of an hour and a half to 2 hours on their own. So this is going to be a bit condensed, but we're going to hit on the main topics. But I just want to let you know that in case you do have any follow-up questions, to please reach out. And I'll be happy to answer any questions. So would my colleague Lizzie Dorman, who leads kind of the GRUs, and I'm typically more on top of the PRUs, and so we'll be happy to answer any questions as they come up. But this was a good reminder for this section as you all are embarking on, there's tons of advocacy events going on within the Texas ASCE section, but there's also the report card efforts, and so this is a great little reminder to have as you move along into 2024 and you lay out your issues that you would like to address with your representatives. So with that, we'll kick off some key terms as they relate to government relations, the first of which being advocacy, second being government relations, and then lobbying, of course. So advocacy really has a broad meaning, right? And actually, let me backtrack 1 second. I should also note, Chris mentioned this, but I do love for this to be interactive, so I'm gonna just keep going and going. If you do use the hands up signal, I'll stop, and I would love for anyone to chime in and either ask questions or just add your own perspectives of times where something has applied to you. I love to make these a little more interactive. So just letting you know that while I start going full steam ahead with these slides, I would love for anyone to jump in as you see fit. But anyways, carrying back on. So advocacy. really broad term. Advocacy can mean, lobbying and being on Capitol Hill and submitting your pitch basically to your representative, but can also be as simple as just talking about an issue over a happy hour or something like that. Or advocacy could be telling your neighbor about something that you care about. Advocacy is a really broad term, and it's one of the most important terms in politics. And so it's any action that speaks in favor of or recommends or argues for a cause, supporting or defending it, and pleading on behalf of others. You have to keep in mind with members of Congress, as well as just state representatives, and people from all different walks of life, electeds. Usually, I mean, they're just like you and me. They might have a couple areas of expertise, but suddenly they're governing over hundreds of different topics that they have to keep in mind. And it takes advocacy to make them aware of those topics. They need advocacy for even the ones that they are aware of, because no one can know everything about any given topic. But especially if they come in on the platform of, hey, I come from the agricultural industry, I know agriculture. And it's like, that's great. But now you also have to deal with education, and you have to deal with defense, and you have to deal with all sorts of different things. So it's really important to utilize advocacy tools to make sure that you are getting your message across to people who really need that guidance from the experts, which you are. Um, so government relations. Government relations really is what we do on behalf of our members. And since ASCE members like yourselves are impacted by all these laws and regulations that are passed in DC and in state capitals and local governance offices across the country, we're focused on educating these policymakers on these issues and alerting members like yourselves about the issues as they come up, as well as opportunities and some of the risks. If we hear, certain funding mechanisms that we typically utilize to improve infrastructure systems are at risk and they're on the ballot to be lessened or something of that nature, well, that's something that we're going to want to rally our members together to advocate on behalf of defending that funding mechanism. But there's also opportunities for improvements through legislation, and so we'll alert you all of those opportunities, and work our best to ensure that these views and these policy positions that we have are represented in the outcomes. And then lobbying. And lobbying sometimes can get I don't know, it could be slandered a bit as a term, and yet traditional lobbying is simply just being influential towards a specific piece of legislation. It's, a lot of people might think of lobbying as all the back channel, um, quid pro quo kind of stuff, but that's really not what lobbying is at its core. Lobbying is simply just advocating for something on the behalf of the greater good, and so that's what we focus on. And I mentioned before, advocacy is really broad, and so oftentimes when you hear the term advocacy, people think of it as just lobbying, but really you want to think of it as a spectrum, right? And underneath this sort of umbrella term, you have these different boxes that all apply to advocacy. This can include, traditional activities such as litigation and lobbying, but it can also include capacity building, relationship building. That's talking about, the things with your neighbor, right? And the community events where you're advocating for certain things, or just over a happy hour talking about certain issues. Forming those networks, and leadership development is another form of advocacy. So we like to say that not all advocacy is lobbying, but all lobbying is advocacy. And if that isn't as clear, I know this is kind of a negative view on it, but it's almost like saying, not all traffic violations are speeding, but all speeding is a traffic violation. Like, it all fits under that umbrella. And so when you're looking at that spectrum, the report card is typically our top advocacy tool, right? And this is created as a public service to both citizens and policymakers to inform them of infrastructure needs in the state. And it's a really easy to follow tool, and that's why it's so heavily cited, because it's something everyone can understand using that A to F school grade format. As you all are familiar with, Texas is always on top of their schedule for their state report cards. So you're all aware of why the report card can be beneficial. We'll get more to that in just a moment. But the report card kind of hits on all these different things, right? There's the education component of it, which is, like the executive summary in a report card. It's explaining the findings and some of the solutions in one concise manner. It's almost like your elevator pitch. There's the research, which is kind of the report itself and the data that goes into it. The coalition and relationship building is like hosting community forums to try and draw awareness to this report, and finding different opportunities, drive-ins like you all have done many times, um, so that you can share this report with the partners and decision makers and community members involved in the solutions that are outlined there. Media outreach and PR, that's more my realm, which is inviting leaders to a public event about the report to draw in more mass attention. Typically, the bigger names you have to do these big outreach opportunities is going to draw more reporters and producers and things of that nature. And the more of them that come from those traditional sources, the better chance there is of getting um, mass understanding, so to speak, of what you were trying to portray in the report. So the more we can get those traditional outlets out there, the more eyeballs are going to be on it. Organizing, that can be voter engagement around an infrastructure ballot measure. So organizing the group that maybe put this report card together, organizing a whole state section to advocate for some of these key solutions, particularly as legislation that pertains to them comes up. And then there's lobbying, which is it's really like the ask, right? Requesting a decision maker takes that particular stand on a report card solution through different legislation or regulation. So first and foremost, we should point out that ASCE can and does lobby. As a 501c3, we are permitted to lobby and advocate for certain issues or regulatory actions. And, we work really close at the state and federal levels to affect these changes on the legislative and regulatory actions. However, we are prohibited from engaging in election activity and endorsing certain candidates. As a 501c3, you are not allowed to do that. So we cannot be giving money to candidates or publicly endorsing them. We can endorse certain issues, right? I remember just a couple years ago when the Democratic candidates in 2020 were putting out their infrastructure plans. I believe it was around January and February of 2020. That's when everyone's plans were coming out. And we were able to support, the plans, so to speak, but we weren't supporting individual candidates. But, and we might do that on a variety of other issues, like a transportation funding ballot measure or things of that nature, things that pertain to ASCE policies. And we can provide guidance on these things as well. We try to work with any and all elected officials. Does not matter their party affiliation. We just this past week was a really cool opportunity. Past President Maria Lehman, who was the vice chair of the National Infrastructure Advisory Council, got to lead the NIAC meeting with President Biden in the room and kind of give guidance on some ASCE priorities. Chiefly resilience opportunities and so many other ways in which we believe that we could streamline the funding coming from the IIJA. And so that's just one example of the opportunities that are created through ASCE and that we are able to engage in, just not necessarily endorse the individual candidate. So public policies, you may be wondering how we determine our public policy agenda and actions and how all of these kind of work their way into everything I just mentioned, because these public policies play a big role in your lobbying and advocacy efforts. So this is our list of 2024 priority issues. And I will note that we do have over 170 public policy positions, which are really great to fall back on when you're wondering about ASCE's stance on something prior to making a major advocacy push or a media campaign. I fall back on them all the time because I put together talking points for people who are about to do media interviews. And so one of the things that I'll try to figure out when I'm coming up with our suggestions is I can simply just Google ASCE policy, clean energy, this ASCE policy, transportation, funding measure that we can get into so many different things. We've got stances on just about every funding mechanism possible, whether it's been passed or not, or it's included in some policy. There is a policy for that. And so, you can look those up, and you always have that to fall back on to make sure that if you are doing something under the umbrella or under the brand of ASCE, that what you're doing is in line with our policies. And so while we do have those policy statements on 3-year cycles led by their respective committees. Every year, ASCE sets a priority issues agenda to focus on lobbying efforts. We want to represent what our members care about the most, and so we find the top 5 to 7 priority issues through a survey that's sent to all of our U.S.-based members every summer. We do take those answers, curate the top 5 to 7 responses, and those become the things that we prioritize the most when we're lobbying on Capitol Hill and working with state capitals. And then these lists are ultimately approved by the Public Policy and Practice Committee, PPPC. It's quite a mouthful, and ultimately our Board of Direction. So as you can see right now, climate and hazard mitigation was a big one. Basically, just resilience issues in general have been on the forefront of our members' minds, and we make sure that that works its way into all of our lobbying and advocacy efforts, as well as workforce and education. We passed this big IIJA, it's fantastic, and then we find that we have an 82,000 engineer gap in order to be able to take care of any of these projects and issues that are coming up through the IIJA. And so we need to streamline the workforce and improve those numbers so we can actually get these projects done. So those are just a couple of the things that we're really focused on at the moment. And as I mentioned before, our chief advocacy tool is that 2021 report card for America's infrastructure. The 2025 report is underway. We are starting that effort. It's crazy to think we are jumping back into that cycle. But yeah, that kicked off about a month and a half ago, and we're starting to meet frequently with our individual committees. So for 25 years, we've been doing this ever since 1998. And 6 of the report cards that we had during that time frame, which by the way we do put out every 4 years, which on the one hand is because it is a massive volunteer effort and we do not necessarily have the time to do that every year. Also, as you all would know, the data on infrastructure, the broader data, really doesn't change that much year to year. We wouldn't have a ton to report on, or we wouldn't really be able to get a sense of the trends as well on a year-to-year basis. And then third, it's a great sort of call to action for an incoming administration or a renewed administration every 4 years. That's why we release it a couple months after the inauguration. So they usually come out early March. So the next one will be March 2025. This one came out March 3rd, 2021. And this was the first ever national report card where we reached a grade that was in the C range. The previous ones had all been in the Ds, which is impressive, especially considering that we had added a chapter, the stormwater. It was the first time we had enough data to do stormwater, and that was a D range chapter. So it shows that there have been some bumps in other areas, such as ports and aviation, drinking water, energy and inland waterways. The only one that went down was bridges. So overall, we were trending slightly up, but obviously C minus is not the grade you want to take home to your parents. So we want to improve on that. And this is just something that elected officials from all sides of the aisle have cited and frequently referred to with the report. You name the politician, they've typically leaned on this report. And yeah, it really doesn't matter what side of the aisle they're on. They tend to find a lot they agree with here, especially when it comes down to the 8 key criteria that lead to these grades. And the media coverage of this, which I'll get to a little bit later on when we transition to more of like the PR component of this, has been immense. That it is just the most cited infrastructure report there is. Tons of reporters lean on this because it's easy to understand. Everyone gets that a C isn't where you want to be and that a D is flat out bad and that anything that's in the Bs is pretty good. And so it just makes it easy, and we break it down for people in a way everyone can understand. Everyone in the world has their own different kinds of expertise. So let's make things easy for them by putting it in a way that the whole country can understand, and take these really complex issues that you all understand well, given your background, but most people don't understand those data sources. They don't understand what all of those grants and funding mechanisms means. And so this makes it easier for them. And that's why it gets cited so frequently. It was actually President Bill Clinton that referenced the report card's grade for schools in 1998. And then this report was even cited in the final legislation for the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. So definitely has some pull. And that kind of leads into this value of the report card. It really does inform lawmakers and the public of current conditions and which direction we're headed. And so this is easy to consume. It's concise. Um, it's not a white paper or a technical paper that's hard for them to digest. We also try to make it as visually appealing as possible so that it's more likely to be read through. And so, yeah, this is intended for audiences that don't really understand infrastructure issues. They understand potholes when it disrupts their alignment, but they might not understand, believe it or not, most people don't know that there is a gas tax, like that's something as simple as that. And so this really tries to simplify things for folks. Um, and it's a really easy to use resource. As this is one of our top advocacy tools, but we have a lot of different tactics you can utilize to get your message across. Meeting with elected officials and decision makers is obviously one of the most effective ones. Emailing and sending letters can also help out. Submitting public comments. There's these public comment periods on all sorts of different pieces of legislation and other more open forums. So submit comments where appropriate. The report card, producing one, updating one, promoting it, getting it out to the media is definitely a way of getting your advocacy efforts out into the public. Having a legislative day. I was with you all last, I want to say April, when you had a legislative day to try and get these issues across. And so that's very effective. Establishing coalitions, the more people come together and fight for a unified or fight on a unified front, the more likely they're going to be heard. So find groups that you can work with. Um, Writing an editorial or a letter to the editor, getting things in the public eye through the media can be really effective because suddenly an elected can't ignore it anymore when their constituents are now reading about it and understanding it. And you can invite public officials to your section and branch meetings as well, which you all have done. You all are very effective at doing that. And so continuing to do that helps build those relationships we talked about. And I just mentioned the letters to the editor and op-eds and things of that nature, which I'll touch on a little later. Well, I guess I can just touch on now. From the PR standpoint, myself and my colleague Rob Marmet, we'll even write those for you if you point out that there's an opportunity, and we can work with you on that. You can either write one and we can help edit it and pitch it. If that is ineffective, we can also try to write one and get one of you to sign off on it and approve of it, maybe provide some input, and then we can pitch it as well. This opportunity came up because of a letter to the editor that one of our members, Mike Pinowski, wrote of our Ohio Council. He was the Ohio Council vice president and a county engineer. He had led this presentation on two stage ditches and wrote a little letter to the editor on that. And that actually drew the attention of an Ohio Congressman, Bob Latta, who then stopped by the Lucas County Engineer's office to learn more about these ditch projects and how they're helping improve water quality and mitigate flooding. So the two met up. Pinowski then took him on a tour, and this was all from posting a letter to the editor in the Toledo Blade. And which was an advocacy measure because he was calling for the federal Ohio delegation to support the National Climate Adaptation and Resilience Strategy Act, which led to this congressman reaching out for a visit. So those kinds of things can create opportunities that lead to actual change. So preparing for meetings. Building relationships with these elected officials and their staffs is really the first step towards effective advocacy. And you can do this virtually. Obviously, COVID and the pandemic really just made that much more of a possibility for folks. So if you don't want to drive all over the state of Texas, which I can empathize with, you can set these up virtually, but you can meet in person. You can just ask if they want to get a coffee. Or things of that nature. That doesn't have to just be colleagues, you know. I do this from time to time with producers or reporters. I've met with producers from Fox and CNN in the same week at different coffee houses in DC, just to let them know some of the stuff we're working on and what's available to them and what issues they should be looking for. Reporters need to know that. So do members of Congress and state legislatures. So set up times with them. You might not get the actual representative, but you might get their staffer, which is can be just as effective. Um, so doing your homework in advance and making an ask, that's really that encapsulates the entire advocacy realm, right? Using these prompts can really lay the groundwork for a strategic pitch. You know, having a story. For some of you that were on the advocacy captains meeting last week, we talked a lot about storytelling, coming up with something where there are personal examples. You want to be personal, you don't want to be political. So you want to go beyond just numbers. Numbers are informative, but they don't resonate necessarily. The personal resonates. Do you have a family member, a friend? Do you personally? Some sort of story about how an issue that you're advocating for has impacted somebody, and then being able to tie those to the numbers. You want that issue to tie into something that a policymaker is personally interested in. All of the policymakers will put all of their subjects out there for everyone to digest. They've got it on their personal websites. They give stump speeches. They've got all sorts of different ways in which they are sharing what they care about, what they'll advocate for. Take advantage of that. Look into what they care about and find a way in which your policy issue, your key priority that you're looking to meet with them on ties into something they care about. That's the beauty of infrastructure, by the way. Of all the topics that you all could be advocating for, you pick the one that has the most bipartisan support you possibly can find. If you find someone who doesn't care at all about roads and bridges or resilience or something, well, they might care about the economy. And so you can tie in economic values associated with certain things. Or if they really just care about public safety and health, there's an infrastructure issue for that as well. So find a way in which this relates to them. And yeah, just leave the politics at the door, focus on the issue. That's what's key. You also want to keep the length of the meeting in mind, and so being brief, focusing on brevity, that's really important. So if you're going to have, you know, let's say 1 minute, you're going to really want to focus on an elevator pitch. What's the who, what, where, quick example, and sort of get out. I think I might be skipping ahead, so maybe let me get that in front of you. So yeah, the elevator pitch. You know, it's a brief introduction to the issue and why the legislator should care, and then give them an action item really quick that they can follow. If you have 5 minutes, that's where you can add more of a personal narrative, right? You can have either your own example or someone else's that they are able to fall back on to weave together some of these issues. So that you could say, okay, here's these big issues. What's the so what? Well, the so what is the personal narrative. And then lastly, the adding a question and response. It's really great when you get people talking. This applies not just to policymakers or members of the media. It applies to everyone in your, even in your personal lives. People like to talk about themselves. Get them talking about themselves. Ask a question that can lead to them engaging so that they're not just sitting there taking everything you're throwing at them. I know that sounds a little ironic considering I'm kind of throwing all this information at you all right now. But really, when you get people talking, they tend to digest issues more, and there's a better chance that they're going to actually want to take action because you're starting a dialogue. Now they're in it. And that's not just for policymakers, that's for staffers as well. They get them talking. And as far as how the meeting goes, right? This is typically the 6 stages of how um, the entirety from pre-meeting to post-meeting goes. You want to arrive 15 minutes before. You always want to be on time, and early is what on time is to go sort of an army or sports mantra. Um, And you definitely want to go through brief introductions for yourself and your team, and how many people you represent. Obviously, they would like to make you happy, but the more likely that they're going to spend their time taking action on an issue is to demonstrate that you represent a lot of people, because that's a lot of votes. That's a lot of people that they're making happy by their actions. Represent how many people, or demonstrate how many people you represent. Stay on message, come up with your 2 or 3 key messages that you want to focus on, and make a clear request, and ask for a commitment, and then listen for their response. Do not just try to talk over them. You're going to want to listen to what they actually have to say and have clear responses for them, which is also a key tenet of both media and well, government relations and public relations, which is um, really do listen to someone's response and be prepared for what the other side is saying. You never want to be blindsided by what the opposition is saying. You want to have a response to it without being defensive. You want to be calm and collected, and just have a clear and concise response, understanding that there might be a little bit of pushback on a given issue. And then that's where you give in the local stories, and then you can give that local story, and then when they're thinking, so what, you say, and this applies to this many people. Or the opposite is true. You can say, this many people are impacted. Here's one such example. Now it's really resonating that this is a widespread issue, and then now they've got the personal angle where you're basically creating a movie in their brain where now they can really visualize it. Always thank them for their time. Have leave behinds, give them something that they can hold on to. Visually appealing leave behinds is also very helpful. We work with that at our legislative fly-in in DC, which I'll touch on in a little bit. We'll provide those for you. So having a leave behind is great. And then offer to set up additional times. And then afterwards, huddle with the team so that you can come up with formal thank you responses to the legislator, and to keep the conversation alive. It doesn't end. It doesn't end with that meeting. So definitely try to keep things going. So now touching on more of the PR side of things is our relationship with the media. We are very active with a variety of media sources. We've formed good relationships with different reporters and different outlets. And this includes all of the major networks that you've heard of, or newspapers that you've heard of, in addition to state and local outlets. And so we try to stay active on that so that when issues arise, they come straight to us and we can get our policy priorities out there, and we can give the best guidance that we possibly can in times of crisis. And it's from forming those relationships. So since January 1st, 2021, ASCE has been mentioned in the news over 80,000 times. It might be 82 at this point. And that includes all those outlets I mentioned: AP, CBS, CNN, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, all of them. And so pretty much every single day, the report card in ASCE is being mentioned. It's because we represent the go-to experts on civil engineering and infrastructure related matters. And those are matters that impact almost every other sector of conversation around the country. And so the reason I mentioned January 1st, by the way, is because that was just a couple weeks before our last Failure to Act economic study came out. For those of you who aren't aware, Failure to Act is the macroeconomic study we work with a team of economists on, to analyze the infrastructure funding gap, assess what it is, and then determine how that impacts each American household as well as certain industries of the economy. So that was just a couple weeks before that came out. And then March 3rd, 2021 is when the latest national report card came out. This is also not too long before the last Texas report card came out. So it is in keeping with the theme today. So yeah, over 80,000 times. It's really a lot of input from members of the media. And so we are just a trusted source because of our members, first and foremost, but also these reports that we can lean on that make a lot of sense to lay people and reporters. As mentioned before, ASCE's mission, is to advance civil engineering and protect the public health, safety, and welfare. And because of that brand, we do have the experts and the public servants that make having our members on as interview subjects and their reports leaned on for stories all the more enticing. So this brand really helps when this is such a technical field. And it means that reporters understand that you went through extra years of training, extra years of schooling to get to where you are. And what's also, I think, helpful for trusting civil engineers is that people can look around them and see that there is a quote unquote infrastructure crisis. They can see how many things need to be repaired. They can see the work that you put in, not all of it, obviously, but they can at least visualize some of the work you do. Whereas a lot of fields, it's done behind closed doors. And so there's really a trust factor with civil engineers because people drive over those bridges every day. They turn on their taps, relying on you for the water to get there. They see people working on transmission and distribution lines. And so because of that, people are able to understand how hard your profession is and how vital it is. So they keep coming to us. So when you're working on anything media related, and this is not much different than government relations, is you need to think about who is your intended audience. For GR, the intended audience is a policymaker, and so you might bring in an outside audience like that personal story to entice them. In this case, you need to reach that outside audience. You need to figure out, are you trying to reach government officials through your media campaign? Are you trying to reach just a section of the public, the business community, residents of a certain neighborhood? When we do our economic study, we focus a lot of it on reaching out to certain business outlets, Business Insider, Wall Street Journal, groups like that, CNBC. You might have an entirely different set of messaging if you're reaching out to the CNNs, the NBCs, the Foxes, and the ABCs. And so you need different messaging for different outlets, and different metrics and data points that you want to highlight. And you need to figure out, why should that group care and how will they benefit from addressing your issue? And you need to find a way to do it in a brief manner. We mentioned brevity for government relations, especially true in public relations, because the average soundbite only lasts about 7 seconds. So it's really key to have your main points all laid out and be able to keep coming back to them and hitting them so that you're able to address each of these key audience members. Now, the next slide, I'll give you a heads up, is a interview with past President Maria Lehman on NPR, talking a little bit about the importance of, at that time, the American Jobs Plan, but what would later become the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, because this was in about April of 2021. So the American Jobs Plan had just been released, and we were kind of being asked our thoughts on it, whether we endorse it or not. And so I will play that quickly, but I'll cut it after a couple minutes because I know that we only have about 20 more minutes of time, so I want to be mindful of everybody else's time. So this is Maria Lehman on NPR.
If you want to assign a letter grade to how bad it is, the American Society of Civil Engineers put out a report card giving American infrastructure a C-. President Biden's American Jobs Plan puts roughly $2 trillion to fixing those problems.
Desperately needed upgrades to unclog traffic, keep people safe, and connect our cities, towns, and tribes across the country.
Maria Lehman is here to tell us about how much this package might do to meet the country's needs. She is one of the civil engineers responsible for putting together the infrastructure report card, and it is good to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
So when you look at what the country needs right now and what the Biden plan offers, how do they compare?
I think it is absolutely a good start. Obviously, this is the beginning of a conversation with Congress, and so it'll be interesting to see how things shake out. I think we have some concerns because if we think that it's about federal, state, and local spending, and so we need to make sure everybody's working together. The gaps that we through our failure to act reports that we did as a run-up to the report card, which is just a little bit under 2.6 trillion, a bigger number than actually has been proposed by the Biden plan.
And in your judgment, what are the most pressing needs? Like, what do we have to fix now or it will break?
I think surface transportation has roads that need to be reconstructed and bridges that need to be rebuilt. I think if you're looking at water and wastewater, there's extreme conditions there, and they're graded poorly because of it. As far as electricity is concerned, we saw what happened with the distribution system in Texas, because that was a function of how the plants operated. But if you look at distribution, for example, if we're shutting down coal-fired power plants in West Virginia, and we're going to replace that with wind power in Texas and Oklahoma, if we don't upgrade transmission lines, we're going to need really big extension cords.
You mentioned bridges, and presidents have been talking about this for so long. In 2011, when I covered the White House, I went with President Obama to the Brent Spence Bridge connecting Kentucky and Ohio, where he gave a speech about infrastructure.
And it's in such poor condition that it's been labeled functionally obsolete. Think about that, functionally obsolete. That doesn't sound good, does it?
That was a decade ago. And so if this stuff was functionally obsolete then, how would you describe it now?
Well, I think there's 42% of all the bridges in the US, which is about 617,000 bridges, are at least 50 years old. And about 8% of them are considered structurally deficient, which means they're in poor condition. The thing that's more alarming to us is, for the first time, the number of bridges in fair condition is bigger than the number of bridges in good condition. So those two lines have crossed, which means we have to up the ante on investment on our bridges.
In practice,
So I'll cut it there. But you might notice that Maria, for one, she understood the medium, right? She understood that she was in a radio interview and she had to accentuate certain words to get her message across. And you just heard that right at the end when she's talking about bridges, right? And she said she slows down her speaking when she wants to make a big point. She emphasizes certain words and then drives the message home. She says that for the first time, and a little pause, the number of bridges in fair condition is bigger than the number of bridges in poor condition. I'm kind of messing up her words, but that tactic allows you to really key into what she's saying and remember what she's saying. She also uses a little bit of humor and alliteration, referring to the extra long extension cords. And so that's just one way in which you can get your message across in a way that everyone can understand. Everyone understood what Maria was getting across there, even though some of those issues are a lot more complex than they might have been addressed in that particular interview. You also might have to address things a little bit differently if you're on TV, and maybe you can get a little bit more into the weeds if it's on print. But knowing your medium is really important. So how can we affect the news? You want to consider story angles and how they matter, know who's talking about the issue, and you want to use the right tool. When you talk about who is talking about the issue, that's identifying your audience, and that's also understanding the opposition. You definitely want to understand what the opposition is saying about something so you don't get caught flat-footed when you're in these interview situations. And you want to think about story angles that you can pitch to people. You don't always have to wait and be passive for a media opportunity to present itself. You do have the ability to create those media opportunities for yourself. Pitching is one such way. Media, all of these tools are ways in which you can create your own media opportunities. So say, for example, you're doing a Texas State report card. You would first issue a media advisory to draw attention to the fact that this is happening. And you don't want to put too much information in there, or it'll kind of lessen the need for a reporter to need to actually go to the event, which you definitely don't want to do because there's less reporters now than ever before. They have very limited bandwidth. So you want to give them a big reason to come, which also is why it's helpful to get elected there using those other advocacy methods. So the advisory tells them that something's coming. You don't want to be too vague, but you also don't want to be too specific. The press release is kind of the summary of your findings, and that's honestly what gets reported on the most. So we'll send those out to hundreds of reporters, and that's oftentimes what drives their story because they don't have bandwidth to go do a bunch of interviews for it. Pitching is individualized outreach to these different reporters and producers. It's letting them know, hey, we've noticed you've been doing stories on X, Y, and Z. We really think that this will be of interest to you. Or it could not even just be for the report card. I remember we did pitching when President Biden was going to visit Pittsburgh, and we got a couple of the Pittsburgh section members together, and we said, hey, are you all available for interviews? We went over talking points. And then I made pitches to about 30 or 40 different reporters, and a couple of them decided to use President Biden's visit as a means of discussing infrastructure activities in Pennsylvania, in Pittsburgh. And so they reached out to our members to conduct these interviews. So pitches are more individualized. They have a better chance of being responded to because it's not just some mass email. And then an op-ed is when you can write a story kind of from scratch. It could be anywhere from 600 to 800 words, draw attention to an issue that people aren't really talking about at the time. Although it does help if that op-ed is piggybacking on something that's already being discussed in the news. Like if the governor just did a State of the State address and you do an op-ed and you try to get it published the next day, and you either commend them for all the great infrastructure mentions in the State of the State, or you point out your concerns that infrastructure didn't seem to be a big priority in the State of the State. So that's a great way to kind of hop on that opportunity and then use the op-ed to draw in attention to your reports and the key issues. And letters to the editor are more in response to something, and they're a lot smaller. Like Mike Pinowski's thing probably would have been about 250 words in response to an article about that act. So that's a way that you can get a response in there. They're not as widely publicized as, say, an op-ed or just a story, but it is also an effective method. See if this goes. All right, media interviews. So studies have shown that of the 100% account of how someone interprets your message, 93% of it comes from the comfort level of how well that message was delivered. So less than 7% of their perception just comes from the words. So you want to make sure, you're not looking at cards, you're not looking uncomfortable, you're not darting your eyes around. You just seem relaxed, and you also don't seem defensive or nervous. You're not doing anything with your hands and being fidgety. You just want to be calm and collected, because that's how someone can trust that you are an expert on a certain field and that you are confident in the answers you're given. That's first and foremost if you want your message to get across. You also want to be yourself. You want to be comfortable and confident. You want to be brief. As I mentioned, the average soundbite is only about 7 seconds long. So you want to ensure that you're not going too long for them to be able to use any of your sound bites. As a former producer myself, I know that sometimes when people would have a great line, but then they would do one of those things where they like kind of keep talking like really fast. And so they made a great point. And now I'm going to go into this other topic over here. Well, now I don't have a clean place to cut it, and I don't want to include the rest of it. So sometimes we might have to just throw that bit out. So it's better if you know what your sound bites are in advance, you hit on it and you take a breather and go into your next point. Being energetic does not necessarily mean bouncing off the walls. It does mean just like showing a passion for what you're doing. This doesn't have to be Tom Cruise on Oprah, but you just want to look like you actually enjoy what you're doing, enjoy what you're talking about, and care what you talk about. And honestly, look, there are negative conversations when it comes to the infrastructure realm and any topic, but focusing on ways in which you can be positive. I love to end interviews. I love to end points that you're making on what can be done as opposed to what just isn't being done. You can start with what isn't being done, but leave a positive note in someone's, leave a positive taste in someone's mouth, letting them know that, hey, there is something we can do about this stuff. It's not all doom and gloom. We mentioned this before on how to nail the interview, understanding your audience, know what you're talking about. I'd also advise don't say things you don't 100% know the answer to. We can always get in touch with reporters after the fact. Using statistics, people like things in threes. If you can do things in threes, I know that's helpful. And come up with your key main message, kind of like how what Maria said was a main message when she talked about the bridges. And that it's concerning because for the first time, and so that's something she could refer back to. She can keep saying, that's great, but we just, yeah, no, that's definitely a big issue. But first and foremost, we've got to address this issue because this is the first time, you can keep bringing it back and taking control of the situation, of the narrative. So repeat that main message and know what the other side is saying. And then lastly, I know we only got a few minutes, so I'll just briefly mention A couple of these tactics. Bridging your message is bringing the topic back to what you were talking about. So if it kind of goes off the rails a little bit and people start kind of taking the narrative and running with it. I remember one example was when a firm had contacted a local school district about water issues, and an engineer had to go be a representative for the meeting, and she was kind of getting berated by the community members. And one of the audience members asked, aren't they just paying you to say everything is okay? Her bridging tactic was to say, well, what I think you were really concerned about is the safety of your kids. And as a mother and an engineer, I would send my children to this school. So she didn't offer a double negative. You don't want to do like the Nixon, I am not a crook thing, because then that's what sticks. She brought it back to what the key issue is. And so that kind of sets the narrative straight. You also want to use flagging, and that's what I mentioned before. That's what Maria used. The most important consideration is, if there's one thing you should know, is it's allowing the audience's ears to perk up, like, hey, if I'm going to remember anything, I should remember this part. Don't do it too much, though, or it kind of loses its value. And then our last section for today, kind of combining GR and PR, is all the resources that are available to you. Starting with PR, if a reporter ever calls, we do have a protocol for this. Please get in touch with myself or Rob Marmette so that we can get in touch with them, figure out their deadline, their angle, when the story is going to run. And then sometimes we might have already been working with an expert on this who would be a good fit. So we might actually place them in for the interview. But more often than not, we'll just work with you on talking points and things to hit, things to remember going forward, and then we'll set up the interview. Also, our key contact program is something that if you're not involved in, please get involved in. It's open to all ASCE members, so you can reach out to us and get signed up for that. It makes you eligible for our Advocate of the Year award, and also eligible for our fly-in, which this year will be February 28th to March 1st. And this also helps develop those advocacy-related relationships, right, with elected officials, because we help craft messages, emails, phone calls, and visits with representatives for you. And so it's a good opportunity to get more involved with advocacy efforts. We also have the Advocacy Captains Program, which is our most specially trained group of key contacts that we rely on for a lot of key issues. And so we'll constantly be referring to them and roping them in to a lot of our advocacy efforts in the state. We've also expanded the number of advocacy captains per state so that we have these smaller working groups to kind of balance the responsibilities that people are tasked with, and diversify the geographic representation of the advocacy captains program, and also to broaden that leadership pipeline. So the advocacy captains really help champion those state report cards and engage in state outreach, check in with lawmakers throughout the year, participate in congressional roundtables, and oftentimes are the ones that will lean on for op-eds and letters to the editor. It's a good opportunity. They also get a special training at fly-in in advance of meetings with representatives. So we're constantly looking to do additional leadership trainings for our advocacy captains. We just did one last week. Our in-person legislative fly-in is going to be February 28th to March 1st. We're really looking forward to that. Last year was a huge success. And so we'll get you in touch with your members of Congress. We'll schedule meetings for you, and then we'll go over trainings and give you on how best to speak with them, as well as provide briefings and key legislative activities and ASCE priorities per state. So we'll do that for Texas as well as all the other states, and then go over some training on how best to do storytelling techniques with these representatives. We've also had a couple big reports come out in the past year. Over the past summer, we came out with this Pathways to Resilient Communities report. I would definitely refer to this when you get the opportunity. This touches on all of our technical tools and resources for community leaders looking to improve their built environment's ability to respond to increasingly severe weather events. So it's just a one-stop shop for everything ASCE, from codes and standards to other reports that these community leaders can lean on. And then we came up in conjunction with the National Governors Association with this workforce challenges best practice, as a lot of stakeholders and leaders are looking for best ways to address the workforce shortage. So that's a great resource. And then one other thing to keep in mind, our 2024 failure to act report is right now tentatively scheduled to come out for late April. Usually it comes out just a couple months before the next report card, but because of the IIJA, we've been getting a lot of questions about about how the investment impacted the infrastructure funding gap, which was 2.6 trillion over 10 years before. I can say that there have been other issues that have come up since then, such as inflation and the bipartisan understanding of resilience measures that are needed. So we're not sure how much it's going to improve the gap, but we're working on that, and that is something that should be highlighted if you've got any sort of legislative days coming up in the next year. I know we only got a couple minutes. I apologize for that, team. But if you do have any questions, I'd like to throw it back to you.
All right, I'm gonna look at the chat and just make sure if anybody has any questions, you can put them in there.
And while in case anyone does pop in with a question, in the meantime, I'll just mention, but that failure to act study for both advocacy and for PR related stuff, that does so much to do the storytelling for you, so to speak. Because yes, it'll come up with these huge numbers that people can hardly wrap their heads around, like, oh my goodness, we're down 2.6 trillion for infrastructure investments. And who knows? That was 4 years ago. That was before we understood just how much was needed for certain resilience measures for all these 17 categories that we cover. But then we also do that hyper focused it costs each American household $3,300 per year in costs due to faulty infrastructure. That's alignments that are done more frequently than they should be, and needing new tires and things like that because of issues with roadways, or it's it's disruptions to the manufacturing industry because of power outages and things of that nature. And so that $3,300 a year, that's when you start to personalize it a little bit. So that can do a lot of the storytelling for you. I also see in the chat from Matt, will the slides be shared, and the failure to act document? The failure to act, when that's released, definitely we're going to blast that we're probably going to annoy everyone with that. That'll be blasted everywhere. I can share these slides as well. And you also have the link to the full interviews. I also add in a couple more slides and send it to you all as well, so that, I was trying to get in under an hour, but I'll add in a few in case you wish to review some of them.
All right, great. Don't see any more questions, so I just want to thank everybody again for participating in today's ASCE Texas Section Technical Webinar. And thank you to Kevin again for